They still talk about the night the wind stepped out of the Alps and walked the Bavarian forest like it owned every hinge and root. Hours before it began, the air went heavy with electricity. Window panes flexed, the dogs put their muzzles to the floor, and the tops of the spruces shivered as if remembering a word they had been punished for. In the forester's lodge at the end of the Forstweg, a chipped white mug sat cooling on a sill darkened by decades of stove smoke, a ring of black tea ghosting the enamel. On a nail by the door hung a green felt hat banded with a boar bristle, and below it a waxed jacket whose elbows shone with repair. On the kitchen table the book lay open where he had left it, a forestry manual annotated to the margins with numbers and little drawings of leaves and bark scars. In the frame near the stove, a photograph, a broad-shouldered man in his 30s standing beside a battered GDR-era Trabant Kubel wagon, one arm flung around a woman smiling with her mouth open as if the laugh had just leapt. Behind them, the forest looked nearer than maps ever let on. On his left wrist, in that photo, a narrow, braided bracelet of deerskin darkened by oil and weather. They called him Forster Anton Ryder when they wanted to be formal, and Tony when they wanted him to borrow their tools and bring them back sharper. He had walked these woods east of Freyung since the late 70s, before the borders softened and the new hiking signs started telling stories in 3 languages. He knew the Bavarian forest by its older names. Buchrucken for that beach ridge that held snow late into April. Tuffelschlucht where the ravine folded itself in shadow. The strip of nice outcrop he called the spine because once he'd slipped on it and stayed angry at geology for a month. He taught schoolchildren how to read bark as if it were braille, how to cup a seedling like a bird, how to tell a spruce's complaint in wind from a pine's. When he spoke, he counted with his thumb, not his forefinger, and he never wasted a syllable. He carried a notebook in the breast pocket of his jacket, a cheap blue one with squared paper, and the graphite wore a trench where the pencil lay. His morning began with the kettle sighing and ended with boots knocked clean on the threshold. In between were tracks, sap, and the neat violence of a saw used correctly. He disappeared in 1986, on a Tuesday thin with rain. He was 41. His last scheduled route traced a loop that took him past the old border fence remnant, along a skid road whose ruts were older than the youngest trees, and up to the oak he always patted, the one that leaned just enough to look interested in people. He had told the office in Grafeno he'd check a bark beetle stand and mark 3 spruces for winter felling. He left the lodge at 6, as he always did. He drank his tea with a pinch of sugar and 1 clove, a habit carried from a storm shelter where a Czech ranger had taught him that sweetness keeps a man civil when the sky is busy. He wore the felt hat, the waxed jacket, the heavy trousers with the brush guard, and the high boots he'd oiled the night before until they looked almost new. He set the photograph back on its little easel, touched the corner as if aligning it with a compass, and went. A hunter on the next ridge saw him at 8, a green figure threading the spruce under a sky that wanted an argument. A mushroom gatherer saw him at 9, near a patch of chanterelles the color of warning. At 10, the first real wind walked the beaches and made the leaves show their paler undersides like a flock turning. At noon the rain arrived with professional indifference. By 3 the forest was a weir of water, everything dripping into everything else. At 4:30, a boy from the Ills Valley found a forester's rifle laid lengthwise beside the path like a line under a sentence. The safety was on. The stock was damp. The strap had a small tear at the hole he never used. No cartridge lay near. No cap. No glove. No notebook. The rifle made a noise when picked up that people remember still, the small click of something finished. They searched the way people search when they've learned to suspect the land and love it anyway. The volunteer fire brigade brought ropes and a map case too clean to belong to anyone who truly worked outside. A police dog led a woman with steady calves and a voice that spoke to the animal as if to a child leaning out of a window. Forestry colleagues in green jackets that had learned every weather spread themselves across the ridges, the whistles at their throats shining like small moons. A helicopter from Passau shouldered the air and stitched patterns over the canopy, thermal camera appearing as if heat were a confession the forest might be persuaded to sign. The search log, which lives now in a drawer that smells of old paper and something like rain, records coordinates and times as if lists can hold back a river. 8:12, Sector A swept. Nothing. Wind from WNW 20 to 30 kilometers per hour. 10:45, Dog Bruna alerts at deadfall near kilometer post 7. Negative upon closer inspection. Mart. 12:03, rifle recovered by juvenile. Chain of custody initiated. Serial confirms writers. 14:26, storm intensifies. Halt aerial. 16:51, teams B, C, D accounting for all. Visibility poor. Cease for night. They found boot prints dissolving into puddles, then puddles that had learned not to be prints at all. They found a boot lace snapped, but not his, a felled flash from sometime closer to 1945 than nerves like to be, a hat once green and now discouraging. They put poles down in muddy verges to see if the earth still held a shape where a person had recently moved. The poles came up in their hands brown with agreement. A man from the mountain rescue with hair that matched the sky said sometimes a storm can pick a man up not by his body, but by his intentions and set him down in a logic no map has room for. A woman from the office wrote, revisit Tuffelschlucht, possible misstep, check every snag. Note, oak at Ryder's Rock stable or not. The oak at Ryder's Rock was older than a dozen governments, its bark thick and cracked like a glacier in slow thought. Its roots had learned every stone near it by both name and weakness. Tony liked to put his palm against it when he passed, the way a man pats a horse to let it know the conversation will be short and honest. No one, then, on those days after the lost rifle, thought the oak had anything to say. It stood its centuries and shook off the storm 2 or 3 leaves at a time like a dignitary acknowledging a crowd. When a man disappears, a second grammar starts speaking. Forms multiply. Subject, writer, Anton. Age, 41. Height, 1.83 meters. Build, wiry. Distinguishing, small scar above right brow, braided deerskin bracelet L wrist. The bracelet made it into the description because the woman in the Graffino office who typed the form had once been given a deerskin bracelet herself. And you remember the things you have to remember in order to make other things bearable. Witness statements read like a chorus dragged through rain. Saw him at 8. Yes, the hat with the boar bristle, the way he carries his chin forward like he's evaluating air. He told me the beetles were cleverer this year than the men who fight them. He stopped at my fence to look at a blue butterfly and called it by the name for which I'll always like him. There are versions people prefer depending on whether the sky in their heads is cloudy or fair. Some said he dropped the rifle to run to something. Others said he set it down because he would not run with a loaded weapon in uneven ground, storm or not. Discipline survives weather. Some said he met someone in the forest, and that conversation had an edge. A darker few said he had been walking 2 roads for too long and chose one, the kind with no return. Those who loved him said it is possible to look like a man who might do that on the days when grief is a whale and still not be that man at all. Those who didn't know him stretched the story until it fit their worldview and then wore it to dinner. The search scaled down to a maintenance of hope. The helicopter went back to being the noise other valleys complain about. The rope teams, after 3 long days in wet that had ambitions to be cold, rolled their coils with the satisfaction that belongs to any finished task, even when it hasn't finished anything. The dog slept on its side with its paws twitching, which is either nightmare or joy, and in either case, honest animal work. The forest drank and made sense of water in ways nobody applauds, because trees cannot bow. Winter's first skin came early that year, a frost that went chalky under the boots by noon and invisible by 2. Snow put its careful handwriting anywhere it could not be argued with. The oak gathered white in its creases and looked as if it had been told a secret it was unqualified to bear. The office put the forms in a folder underneath other folders and typed closed pending new information because bureaucratic compassion requires both words in exactly that order. His wife, Monica, the woman in the photograph whose laugh had always been quicker than sorrow, came to the lodge twice a week and opened windows so the air could accept that a house goes on. She left his mug where it stood and turned the photograph toward the room each time as if the light could instruct it to keep doing the job pictures do. Years insisted. The path he had walked grew a complicated new vocabulary of saplings and shrubs, as if the forest, embarrassed, wanted to erase the line that pointed nowhere. New foresters learned the loops with different boots and brought a different kind of authority to the same problem trees. This oak beetle, that storm, this budget. People began to say Tony's name softly when they said it at all, as if the forest owed him privacy and talking too loud might make the debt larger. But the forest does not keep one mood forever. It can be generous in the exact language of an apology when it wants to be, and when it is angry it chooses verbs people do not own. In late August, decades after the rifle found the boy's hands and the boy learned what fear weighs, the pressure patterns over Bohemia wrote something rude to the satellite that nobody in the village cafe saw because coffee and cards and gossip were making their own weather. The thunderheads rose from behind the ridge like an army that had been paid in cash. Warm air ran ahead of the front and made the shutters nervous. The cows lowed not because cows know what's coming, but because cows talk to each other in vowels anyway. People who have lived in such places forever went out to bring in what can be brought in and to remind stoves that nothing is permanent. The first gusts banged doors that had been taught better. The sky went the color of an old bruise. Birds vanished into the grammar of survival. Rain tested every doctrine of verticality and found most wanting. In the hour when the storm was teaching needful humility, the oak at Ryder's Rock spoke the one sentence it gets to say in a century and laid down. Not a snap, not the pistol crack of a lightning-killed spruce, not the screech of roots doing violence to the earth that had mothered them, but a deep exhalation, as if what kept it upright had finally been forgiven. The ground flexed. The root plate rose like a coin bent by someone strong enough to bother. An earth that had held its tongue for a generation opened its mouth. No one was there to see it, which is why the story can be told without photographs and still be true. The storm recited itself into evening and then into the kind of tired that makes roads shine. The next morning smelled of rinsed metal and splinter, and men from the Forstbetrieb went to count damage in a ledger that cannot include the things that matter most. From down the slope, even before they reached the root pit, they could smell the oldness in the fresh soil, the tannin of time disturbed. The oak lay on its side as if taking a long nap it had postponed through monarchy and republic. In the tangle where roots had laced themselves through stone and around stone and into stone, something white said an impolite hello to morning. They did not climb into the pit. They stood with their hands on their hips or on their belts, the way men stand when they want to accept something without becoming its owners. One of them took off his hat. Another gestured toward the lodge up the track, toward the mug that had never been washed well because the tea stain was part of the point, toward the photograph that had been doing work longer than most people have jobs. They did not say his name yet. The youngest among them, who had not been born when the rifle found the boy, said, "Sol Enwer," and left the verb unchosen. The police were called. The tape stretched across the path did not argue with anyone. The dog, older now and born long after Bruna, lifted its nose and then put it down again as if scent were a matter for other centuries. The photographer slipped in the mud and smiled because embarrassment is not illegal. The root plate held what it held, and if you looked at it quickly you could believe you were seeing roots only. If you allowed your eyes to do the work the brain had already done, you saw more than roots. In that tangle of living wood and dead wood and soil that had met more leaf litter than rain, the color of bone explained itself to daylight. They found the bracelet first. Or perhaps it is fairer to say the bracelet found them, because leather that has slept with roots remembers hands. It was not on a wrist anymore. Nothing was on anything anymore, but it lay in the angle of two roots like a carefully placed answer. The deerskin had darkened to the color of wet bark. The braid had held, stubborn as the man who wore it. Beside it, something that could not be mistaken if you have ever held the truth of a skeleton in your mind even once. The smooth curve of a humerus, the neat gear teeth of vertebrae, the fan of ribs like the remains of a basket. Soil spilled over everything in a generosity that tried to make it all less abrupt. No one reached in with bare hands. The foreman said the word that slows disaster down enough to let duty catch up. They flagged, they measured, they wrote, they waited. Rain the color of tin came and went. The oak looked unrepentant. On the table in the lodge the tea ring looked as if it had taken a breath after all this time. Monica, who had married again and then had outlived that man too, came because someone had to say the name out loud once, properly, in front of the forest. She stood at the edge of the tape, the photograph inside her pocket like a saint's card, and she did not cry because most deserts are private. What lay between the roots would be explained later in the vocabulary of radii and ulni, of dental enamel and isotope signatures, of soil acidity and the slow kindness of oak tannins. But that afternoon in the softened light after the storm was only the prologue to explanation. The men in uniform took off their caps in a way the manuals do not include. The youngest, whose question still had no verb, said the name at last, Tony. The forest, having finished its sentence, did what forests do best. It listened. The forensic teams worked slowly, because slowness is the only respect left when years have already hurried. Each fragment was numbered, brushed, lifted, placed into trays lined with the same care used for relics. The humerus came first, light in the hand, yet heavy in what it confessed. The vertebrae clung together as if they remembered how to be a spine. The ribs flared and collapsed, an architecture both fragile and insistent. From the soil near the root ball came the skull, its sutures closed, the jaw still bearing the uneven line of teeth that matched the dental chart once made in the Graffeno clinic. In its hollows lay a pebble and a snail shell, gifts of the earth to a head that had not asked. The bracelet was sealed in a pouch and marked, Evidence Item 14, braided deerskin band, found with remains. The official statement read like a document trying to be polite. Skeletal remains discovered beneath upended oak root plate near Ryder's Rock. Preliminary assessment consistent with missing Forester Anton Ryder, disappeared 1986. But the villagers had no need of official sentences. They walked down to the forest edge that evening and looked toward the slope where tape fluttered. Some brought candles in jars, others brought silence in pockets. A boy asked his mother if the oak would be planted again. She said trees decide for themselves when to stand. In the tavern they spoke of him as if he had just left, not as if 36 years had passed. They remembered his way of naming butterflies, his scolding when wood was stacked against the wall without air between, his laugh when a child confused spruce and fir. They remembered the rifle set down like punctuation. They remembered that a man is not finished when he disappears. He is finished when people stop expecting his return. The laboratory in Munich confirmed identity by DNA cross-referenced with a niece still living in Passau. The soil told a story, too. Tannins from the oak had slowed decay, iron had colored bone, roots had wrapped themselves in a protection both indifferent and precise. No sign of trauma, no cut, no bullet, no fracture. The forensic pathologist said the most likely was disorientation in storm, collapse near the oak, gradual burial as roots thickened and earth accumulated. But probability is not certainty, and certainty is the one hunger no archive can feed. So the other versions walked out again. Some said he met someone in the storm who meant him harm. Some said he chose the oak as a confessor. Some said the forest does not permit witnesses when it teaches humility. All the versions sounded reasonable if you already believed them before they were spoken. The file was closed, formally this time. Cause of death, undetermined. Contributing factors, exposure, storm, environment. Manner, accidental. But in the notes, in smaller type, one line. Symbolic artifacts recovered. Bracelet, notebook fragment, enamel mug. Because in the mud near the roots they had also found half a page, squared paper blurred, but legible enough to see his hand. Storm building. Oak steady. Rifle safe. Below that, nothing but water stains. The ink wandered off the lines and into the years. His funeral was held in the parish church of Freyung, on a morning that smelled of autumn even though the calendar still said summer. The coffin was light, filled with bone and soil, and the bracelet laid on top. The photograph from the lodge stood at the foot, his smile now doing work for 2 lifetimes. Monica walked behind, slower than age required, because grief teaches pace. The new foresters carried the coffin as if it were their ledger, careful, solemn, recording weight not in numbers but in steps. Bells rang, villagers gathered, candles flickered. They buried him in a plot near the edge of the cemetery, where spruce branches leaned close. The marker read, Anton Reiter, 1945 to 1986. Found 2022. Beloved Forester. The word found was carved deeper than the others, as if to make up for delay. The newspapers wrote it differently, depending on who was telling. Some said, Storm reveals skeleton of missing forester. Some said, Oak gives up secret after 36 years. A Munich daily preferred, forest mystery solved. But it was not solved, not entirely. Mystery remains when cause is a shrug, when certainty is denied by roots, when a man's last act is still written only in inference. In the tavern, they said, the forest kept him because it wanted someone who loved it without pretending. In the cafe, the storm had been his undoing, nothing more. At the school, children asked why the dog had come back, but not the man. The teacher said sometimes loyalty cannot carry weight. Time, which had already done enough, did what it always does, it moved. The oak lay as timber, later cut into boards stored in the forestry depot. One board found its way to a carpenter who, not knowing its history, made a bench for the town hall. People sit on it now while waiting for documents to be stamped. The bench does not tell its story, but the grain holds the shape of years that once wrapped around a man's bones. The bracelet rests in the small museum in Grafenau, beside the rifle and the notebook fragment, under glass that tries to be transparent but only succeeds in separating. Visitors lean in close. They read the card. They say the name softly. Some leave a handprint on the glass before walking away. Monica passed 2 winters later. In her will she asked that the photograph remain in the lodge, that the mug not be washed, that the book stay open on its page. She wrote, let the forest keep speaking through silence. Her daughter visits sometimes, sets wildflowers in a jar by the photograph, touches the bracelet through the glass, listens. She says the forest sounds different now, not crueler, not kinder, but more articulate, as if it has learned another language of wind. And so the story settles where most such stories do, between knowledge and absence. A storm felled an oak. Roots yielded bone. A bracelet returned from soil to light. The forest confessed only enough to be noticed. A man once walked into rain and did not walk out. The rifle waited. The mug cooled. The photograph endured. The bracelet circled his wrist until roots claimed it. Decades later, the earth exhaled, and the skeleton lay between roots like punctuation, declaring nothing, demanding nothing, simply existing as proof that disappearance is not always forever, but explanation can be. The Bavarian forest holds its secrets with the patience of centuries. Sometimes it returns them. More often it does not. But when it does, it is never everything. Just enough to remind those left behind that mystery is not solved by finding, only accompanied.